Hello and welcome to a special U.S. edition of The Curator on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Termack. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from our coverage of the U.S. presidential elections on Monocle Radio, with highlights from our studios at Midori House, from here in Washington, D.C., and from around the United States. This week, we take a ride with the Dallas PD.
She might be prone to have weapons inside the apartment. Right now, we just don't know.
And we discuss the role of democracy on the ballot on Tuesday.
In 2022, this was definitely a campaign issue, but it was an emerging campaign issue. But it is something that's become more politicized over the last 2 years.
All that and much, much more over the next hour here on The Curator with me, Chris Termack. For the past month, Monocle Radio's daily show The Briefing has been running themed U.S. election specials every Tuesday, and we started with a look at the role of crime and policing in the United States, a perennial issue that has only become more challenging since the pandemic. Monocle's U.S. editor Chris Lord took a ride along with the Dallas PD to get a sense of what they've managed to get right and what other police departments and even the White House can learn from them.
Can you repeat your element stuff on North Badge?
Badge is 7814.
It's high noon here in Dallas, Texas, and I'm in the back seat of an unmarked Dodge Charger of the Dallas Police Department. At the wheel is Major Jason Scoggins, and we're here to see a revolutionary violent crime plan being put into action.
There's a female at a nearby apartment complex, and she has an active warrant for manslaughter. She hit someone with their car. They ended up passing away as a result. And through the investigation, they have figured out who the suspect is. It's this female. And now there's a warrant issued in the title of manslaughter, which is a felony 3 warrant.
And the belief is that she's in one of these housing blocks that we're surrounded by at the moment. Is that right?
Yes. We have officers that are covert. So they're in regular street clothes, regular car. They're not undercover because they don't conduct business in an undercover capacity. Their main function is surveillance. And in this case, surveillance and confirmation of the suspect being at the location they believe her to be at. We will wait and see if she comes outside. She might be prone to have weapons inside the apartment. Right now, we just don't know. And so it is very dangerous to try to make entry on an apartment when you have the unknown behind the door.
Dallas has a violent history. Like many big cities in the US, there has been a complex, often troubled relationship between its police and the people they serve. Just in August, Officer Darren Burks was shot by a local man as he was sat in his squad car waiting between assignments. In the DPD's museum, there is a memorial to the 5 officers murdered in 2016 by a man seeking what was described at the time as payback for the death of black men in police custody around America. Nevertheless, in this election year, when public safety is high on voters' concerns, the success of Dallas's plan in reducing crime and restoring trust in the service has caught the eye of other cities. Police Chief Eddie Garcia is the plan's author.
There is not a community impacted by violent crime, whether in California or in the city of Dallas, regardless of language spoken, racial makeup, or economic status, that I ever heard the words, "We want to see less of you in our neighborhoods." I never heard it. And so when I would talk to some media outlets that they would talk to continue to, some media outlets would continue to try to drive this wedge that it was the police versus the community, I'm sitting there going, you may say that to other chiefs that work on their desks every day, but I'm out there.
Born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, Chief Garcia is a veteran of the San Jose Police Department in California and is the first person of Latino heritage to run Dallas's force. The plan he came up with has echoes of a few old ideas of hotspot policing, specifically those that were enacted in New York in the 1990s, but it updates them for our time, mindful of criticism, especially from New York's African-American communities, about the methods used at that time. He is seeing success.
total violent crime in the city, including property crime, is down almost 11.5%. Property crime is down 11%, and violent crime is down almost 13.5%. We divided the city of Dallas into about 101,000 grids. They're 330 by 330 feet. We were able to treat at the time about 46 grids. It's a very, very small percentage, but they were responsible for approximately 10% of the city's overall violent crime. So the thinking was, if we reduce violent crime in those specific grids at the time, which was only in the mid-40s, that we will see reductions in violent crime citywide, which is exactly what we saw. Now, we made promises. We weren't going to conduct oversaturation. We weren't going to be doing stop and frisk. And one of the dynamics that's occurred...
Which I should just say, both of which were figures of the kind of policing that we saw in New York in the 90s in broken windows theory.
Yes. Because we treat our grids in two ways, by being visible and being present at certain times of the day, and by having intelligence-led policing at which individuals are responsible for violent crime and what root causes in those neighborhoods are responsible for violent crime. And so what we found is we not only found that we had massive reductions in our grids that led to reductions in the city's overall violent crime, but we were making less arrests citywide. And so being surgical that way and really trying to target the right areas really not only led to those reductions, but led to a lot of community trust.
Garcia believes that the success of his plan relies on building trust in the community in his cops. In 2023, polling company Gallup found that confidence in law enforcement across the US had dropped to 43%. According to the chief, restoring trust comes with transparency.
I want to find out where my blind spots are, where we need to get better before anybody else does. And so bringing in an outside expert, a criminologist, to look through, to have the knowledge base that he has seen what has occurred nationally in departments that have lost their way, and what did those departments go through? What were the issues that they had so that we ensure we never lose our way? And so the Constitutional Policing Unit, particularly working with an outside source, really is giving ourselves our own patterns or practice investigation. Everyone should have this type of unit. I want to do things and change the department before someone tells me to.
What would you like to see in the next administration in their attitude towards justice and addressing some of these things at a federal level that we've just been talking about?
From a national perspective, we need to go back to accountability. I think people need to go into neighborhoods. And I'm not talking about talking to special interest groups, and I'm talking about go into impacted neighborhoods, hear what they want. So these rogue DAs that are around the country that are not prosecuting crimes, the irresponsible decisions made by judges with regards to bail and bond on individuals that have committed gun crimes. We cannot look in the mirror and say we take gun crime seriously in this country while individuals that we know have committed gun crime that my men and women risk their lives to arrest are back out on the street in 2 weeks. Those are things that I would love to be looked at the federal level.
Eddie Garcia. Defund the police, according to him, is a ridiculous idea. But those who marched and protested under that slogan in 2020 and beyond would argue that they are just concerned citizens, worried about heavy-handed policing, which too often has turned deadly in America. So what do those in Dallas, the communities themselves, make of the plan? Antong Lucky, a former gang member who spent time in prison, is president of Urban Specialists, an organisation that brings law enforcement into communities to talk to local people about their concerns.
We did the first ever gang peace treaty with the Bloods and Crips here in Dallas, where we had over 400. Ain't been all good. I don't make it seem like it's been all good, because Chief Garcia is just one person. This mentality that he has to go down through the 35 or 3,400 men that look up to him. And sometimes it's not well received. If you look at his track record, he disciplined his officers. And the same, when you look at Urban Specialists, what we do, when there's an incident, we have people in our community who are doing some stuff, we stand firmly against that. And I think that's the trust building process. During the height of George Floyd, I say this, we did over 2,800 surveys, and we asked specific questions, right, about policing. And 93 of the respondents on those surveys at the height of George Floyd said that we wanted more police. We just don't want to be profiled and harassed, but we want police in our community so we can feel safe. In the nightly news, you don't hear that. You only hear defund the police. So we wanted to bring to the light the voices of the neighborhood people who live in these communities.
The next administration, whoever that might be, if you were going into the White House, what would you say to them on day one about restoring that trust in public safety and making people feel more safe in their communities?
We should make it imperative that we establish Office of Violence Prevention offices in all of the country and use the model that you see here in Dallas. But I believe if we have an administration in the White House that takes this serious, I think that in probably 5, maybe 10 years from now, every city in America can see a drop in reduction of violence, because there are individuals in every city that I go to who are working to address this problem.
For Monocle in Dallas, Texas, I'm Chris Lord.
If there are two conflicts that have dominated the headlines in the period between the last presidential election and this one, it would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Israel's war with Gaza and Lebanon. And while foreign policy does not always figure to be a major topic in presidential campaigns, this year does feel like it matters more than most. Well, joining me to unpack what the election means for these two parts of the world were Lily Bivings, business editor of the Kyiv Independent, and Natasha Lindstedt, professor of government at the University of Essex. I began by asking Lily whether she was surprised that recent polls showed voters trusted Trump over Harris to handle Ukraine, and what that says to Ukrainians about the U.S. outlook.
From Ukraine, it's extremely surprising to hear that someone like Trump would be able to handle this or is more trusted to deal with these, just probably because of the statements he says about having a good relationship with Putin, or that he would be able to end this war quickly. And when you're living here in Ukraine and you know how difficult ending this war would be, and that having a good relationship with Putin probably isn't something that works well in Ukraine's favor, it's surprising. But perhaps as an American, and maybe I'll speak for Americans briefly, these wars started under Biden administration. So perhaps the idea is that, well, if they started under him, then maybe someone else might be able to stop them, or he could handle them better. But from the Ukrainian perspective, this is surprising and also quite worrying, I think.
Natasha, what do you make of that, to bring you in on this? I mean, Lily's point also there could apply to the Middle East as well. Is a poll like this a verdict on sort of trusting Trump to handle the Middle East better, or is it about trusting Trump to keep the U.S. out of these things completely and blaming Biden for somehow getting the U.S. in the first place?
It's a good question. It's hard to say, because some of it is just Trump's base that just believe no matter what he does or says, he is in control, he's in charge, they just trust him completely. And then you have these other people that seem to believe that someone new, and so not the continuation of the Biden administration, would be better at solving these problems, as Lily mentioned, that the wars, they started while Biden was president, and that Trump could come in there, and they maybe believe his rhetoric that he alone, his rhetoric is, of course, Trump's rhetoric is that he alone is going to solve all these problems. And he can solve, conflict in the Middle East. He can solve the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, that's not true. But the way he speaks so confidently about things, some people do believe it. And I also think there's just some fatigue. If you look at the way the Republicans supported the U.S. providing support for Ukraine back in March of 2022, 49% of Republicans claimed that the U.S. wasn't providing enough support. Now, if we fast forward to a poll taken in the summer of 2024, you saw that only 16% of you had the opposite. You had that 49% of Republicans thought that we were providing too much aid for Ukraine. So I think there's some fatigue that's involved here, particularly amongst the Republican Party.
And Lily, to that, one of those points from Natasha as well, Donald Trump certainly makes a regular point of saying, I alone can fix these things. And as you mentioned too, he has talked about ending the war in Ukraine quickly. Is that in the mind of Ukrainians over there? I mean, is there a sense that they almost have to make as much progress as possible before the end of the year?
Yes, definitely. I think, being able to make progress quickly on the battlefield is contingent upon many things. So I think, of course, the soldiers would love to do that, but that's not exactly in their power. And so I think for the administration, the Zelensky administration, it's about getting as many weapons and as much support as you can before the election. And that's what you see with him going around and presenting his victory plan to Biden, Kamala Harris, to even Trump, to different European leaders. He was looking forward to this Ramstein meeting that was postponed, and he was calling it a special, he said it was going to be a special meeting, that, I think he was hoping for some big weapons announcements. So I think there's this rush, this sort of flurry of diplomacy on behalf of the Zelensky administration to try and get as much support and as many decisions made as possible before this election, because it is uncertain. And it's uncertain whether Trump will try and push Ukraine into some negotiations with Putin, or will just, basically pull the plug on support for Ukraine. And I think the Zelensky administration, rightfully so, is very nervous. Of course, publicly, their stance is that they will be open to working with any president, that they will work with Trump, that, they don't have a problem. They're not involved in U.S. politics. That's not their business. But of course, when you see these actions over the last couple of months, and even right now and over the next couple of weeks, you can see that the Zelensky administration is nervous and is worried about the outcome of the election.
Natasha, you touched on some of the kind of isolationist tendencies growing in the Republican Party. This isn't necessarily anything new also for the U.S. I mean, there's been pulling back from engagements in Iraq, Afghanistan, now this talk of pulling back, at least from some quarters, when it comes to Ukraine. If we do look at the Middle East, though, perhaps it's interesting that this has not reached Israel. And I do wonder what your perspective is on that. Could it reach Israel? Could there be more calls to withdraw support for Israel as well? Could Donald Trump get bored and change all of that, frankly?
I mean, the situation in the Middle East is grown increasingly complicated. So for the longest time in American politics, much of the U.S. public supported Israel. The reporting on Israel was very one-sided. There wasn't much supportive of writing or really humanization of the Palestinian side, or illustrating the humanitarian crisis there. And things have really changed and shaken things up. To the degree that it may affect the U.S. election, particularly in the state of Michigan, where you have some 300,000 Arab Americans who are incredibly disappointed by Biden's handling of the conflict and overt support for Israel, they may decide not to vote. And in the 2020 election, Biden won over Arab American voters by winning about 60%. They could decide that they're not going to vote. They could decide to vote for Trump. You have traditional Republicans that tend to be supportive of Israel, but you also have many traditional Democrats that are supportive of Israel as well. I mean, Trump has made it clear that he's going to be very supportive of Netanyahu, and it's very personalistic. It is that relationship that he's formed with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is banking on that because he's able to manipulate Trump quite easily to leave the Iran nuclear deal, for example, or to basically give Israel free reign to do what it wants to do. And at this point, I think that Netanyahu is hoping that he can get both the U.S. and Iran in some kind of regional war. So it's unpredictable. It's hard to say what's going to happen if Trump comes into play, but he's proved to be someone who wants to please Netanyahu, and that was illustrated by moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
You are listening to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Chris Chermak. For the Foreign Desk this week, we decided to approach an over-reported U.S. election from a counterintuitive perspective, highlighting the policies that you did not know the American political parties held. We started with the little-known fact that former Republican President George W. Bush more than doubled America's foreign aid budget. And for that, Andrew Mueller spoke to Andrew Natsios, administrator of the development agency USAID under Bush. He began by describing George W. Bush's motivations for boosting foreign aid.
Well, I wouldn't call it a charitable mission because charity is sort of giving stuff away. He did see it from a moral standpoint. I actually am more, people think of me as a humanitarian crusader and a human rights person. I'm actually a realist on foreign policy, not a liberal internationalist. I think it's in our interest to have a stable world order. I believe in American leadership, robust American leadership in the world, and a robust foreign aid program because it's in our national interest. It also, when it's done properly, is in the interests of the country. It has to be mutually reinforcing. But there's no way of justifying $40 million a year simply based purely on altruism. But that's where the president came from. He thought we had an obligation as a great power to try to stimulate economic growth in the developing world. I mean, he was very big on trade capacity building. He had a lot of money in trade capacity, more probably than any other president, on focusing on economic growth. So if you look at his projects, they're not charitable projects. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which he set up, there's special legislation on this. A lot of that went for infrastructure. I don't mean giant Belt and Road initiatives of the Chinese, but it went for roads and bridges, and I think a couple of port facility projects were in there. In any case, so answer your question, I would say he's more on the altruism side, but in a broad sense. I think he thought that it was in our national interest too.
I mean, when you think back on that period, though, are there specific achievements that you think can be attributed to Bush's approach to foreign aid? Something you could point at and say that happened because he made it happen, and he made it happen for those reasons?
I would say generally in the stable democratic countries in Africa, the United States put a lot of money. We were spending $1.2 billion in development assistance in Africa when Bush became president. By the time he left office, we were spending $8 billion a year. And I don't mean on emergencies. This is separate from food aid and emergency response. This is long-term development. The other great success story is the PEPFAR program, is the HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis program. And it's not just HIV/AIDS, it's also malaria. There's been a 50% drop in the infection rates in the countries where Bush did the malaria initiative. A trade increased dramatically. We spent $800 million a year on economic growth and trade capacity building so that African business people could access American markets. That would never be acceptable now with all the tariffs and the anti-foreign, rhetoric and all that, which I'm disgusted by. But he was very big on it. Most international conservative internationalists were very big on trade. That's not true anymore for half the Republican Party. The other half still supports it. But if you look at the growth rates in trade between Africa and the United States, I don't mean oil. I'm talking about manufactured goods, processed goods in Africa. There was a dramatic increase. The other big success stories when he was president is this public-private partnership initiative, which is going on to this day. It's $6 billion a year in private money from corporations and foundations, non-traditional donors, the largest of which is the Gates Foundation. When I started in AID, the Gates Foundation had no staff at all. And they put a staff person in AID. We gave them a desk. And they said, all they did was health. They said, we will do parallel investments. Wherever you're doing work, we'll do the same work, except we'll double the budget with our own money. And the Gavi, I don't know if you know Gavi, but the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations in Geneva, we helped create that. We put $150 million in it. Gates put $900 million, $800 million and $900 million in it, far more than any other donor. But we helped orchestrate that in AID because of this public-private alliance. So that is now taken off, and there's about $6 billion a year that comes in. It doesn't come into aid, and we don't give $6 billion to these private entities. We jointly invest in the same project that AID designs and manages. I might add, he never gets credit for any of this, which used to annoy. He used to tell me, I get very annoyed. No one ever talks about what I've done. The left hates me so much, they will not give any credit to us for what we've done.
I mean, just finally, and to bring us to the present day a bit, and I suspect to even ask this question is to answer it, but do you get the sense that there is any of that kind of attitude at large in the Republican Party now, and especially what might be the next Republican administration?
Well, I don't want to get into partisan politics because I'll get into a lot of trouble here. In the Senate, there are 49 or 50 Republicans, and Rand Paul used to propose a 50% cut in aid spending every year. He'd get 10 Republican votes in favor of it, all the Democrats would vote against it, and 40 Republicans would vote against it. So there are 10 people in the Senate who regularly vote for massive cuts in foreign aid and among the Republicans. But the overwhelming majority of Republicans in the Senate voted to protect the aid budget. The two people who've been the biggest supporters of aid in the Senate, in either party, are Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham. When Donald Trump tried to cut the aid budget by 32% his first year, you should look up his comment. He made a public comment. He said, "What idiot wrote this budget?" He never used Trump's name, but he was very critical of it. And he restored all the spending because he was the chairman of the Foreign Appropriations Committee. So there is a large Republican majority in the Senate on foreign aid. The House has Republicans who support it, but they're not a majority. I would say the caucus is split in the House, while 2/3 to 3/4 of the Republicans in the Senate are supportive of foreign aid.
We turn now to immigration, one of the top issues in the 7 swing states that will decide the U.S. presidential election. So what is the picture of the southern border? Eddie Jones is an architect, and his studio in Tempe, Arizona, has designed several of the points of entry along the border with Mexico. He spoke to Monocle's U.S. editor Chris Lord about his first project in Nogales in 2014, redeveloping an old border post built in the 1970s that was showing its age. Chris started by asking Eddie what the border represents to him.
Jones Studio, we feel the border is what connects our two countries. There are others, and you know them, who think the border is what separates the two countries. Now, I even have a house in Mexico. I cross the border for pleasure, frequently and return. And to be able to experience the culture in Mexico is a privilege. It's wonderful, wonderful people. So I'm happy that I live in a border state. And if you've never been to a border town, there's Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora. They're sister cities. And it's remarkable how, the ambient population of these border towns. It's so surprising that the policy is written for the ambiguity in the ambient population, the transient population. I think that's almost poetic. And so, given the connectivity of our two cultures, I am proud to be, that my work has an impact on making people feel respected, and also at the same time representing the dignity of our government. Those are important, impactful things we do.
Donald Trump says that the greatest invasion in history is happening at the southern border. That's a part of the US that you know very well. You've done work down there. What do you make of that claim?
Well, I don't know what he's talking about or what any of the other politicians that say such things are talking about. Several months ago, I was outside having lunch with the port director at one of the Arizona ports, and the birds were singing, the weather was beautiful, the trucks were moving, the people were moving. It was so, not chaotic. It certainly could not be described as an invasion. And from Yuma to Douglas, Arizona, and everything in between, I have never witnessed anything that would be called an invasion. Invasion's a military word. It implies people are carrying weapons and, planning an attack and that sort of thing. It's absolutely untrue. It's so untrue you can't even call it an exaggeration. It's just misleading.
You wrote a very interesting opinion piece in the Arizona Press, essentially responding to some of the allegations that have been made by former President Donald Trump about the state of the southern border. You did also say that the immigration system is obsolete. What does that mean, Eddie, when you say that?
If you are from Mexico or Guatemala, just pick a country south of us, and you recognize that America, despite the contentiousness, is still a very attractive place to be. Which would you rather do? Would you rather try to, smuggle yourself in or come in legally? Of course, you want to come in legally, but the immigration system does not allow that. Now, I'm going to contradict myself in that when we did the modernization of the land port of entry down in south of Yuma, that's called the San Luis port of entry, that was necessary because migrant farm workers were having to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to begin queuing up in order to get to the fields on time. The point being, there's a labor shortage. Well, I'll back up. There's hundreds of thousands of acres of produce that has to be planted and maintained and harvested, and the labor force is in Mexico, and somehow our obsolete immigration system made it possible to issue 8,000 work permits, and now we're working in Calexico, same situation, and our government has issued 15,000 work permits. So if that can happen, why isn't it happening everywhere? Because, after all, there is a labor shortage in America and a surplus of labor across the border.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
You are with The Curator, our weekly highlights show here on Monocle Radio, and I'm Chris Chermak. In a special edition of The Urbanist this week, our editor-in-chief Andrew Tuck was joined by a longtime friend of the show and our proud Boston-born correspondent, Jessica Bridger. The focus was less on the US presidential candidates and more on the issues and getting a state of the nation when it comes to urban areas. Jessica began by describing how housing fits in with the idea of the American dream and where the country stands on the issue of putting roofs over people's heads today.
The housing crisis is an issue of affordability. And what we're seeing with the rising homelessness and the rising visibility of it is the lowest common denominator for that condition. So the visibility then of people who are completely unhoused is a direct result of affordability issues that affect pretty much everyone in the United States, because it's affecting both renters and owners and those who are not able to do either. Mortgage rates are extremely high, even with the recent Fed rate cut, and prices are even higher and keep increasing. Many people are priced out of the buyer's market, right? They're locked into old mortgages with low rates, even if the housing is unsuitable, whether it's too big or too small, or they're subject to extremely high rents in many metro areas. So the causes to this are complex, but it really comes down to an issue of supply. There's just not enough housing stock, and not enough is being built. So there's not enough in the pipeline. And that's a problem of developer returns on investment, bad and greedy landlords, the rather insidious and famous example of private equity buying mobile home parks and raising fees dramatically. Again, that's something that's going to impact the people who are typically at the lowest end of the economic scale the most. The next step out of a mobile home park for many people is going to be being unhoused or partially housed. So this is a question really of also political will. More funding is needed for lower income housing. More incentives are needed to build housing for low and middle incomes. Legislation is needed to enable development in all sectors of the housing market. And developers can't develop what they can't afford. And that comes down to incentives that would let them build more, and other political levers that acknowledge the real economic forces that are going on in the U.S. housing market.
Now, Jessica, moving on to one of the other major issues in the country, let's explore the world of transport and the use of the car. What's your feeling about the direction of travel, as it were, for the US when it comes to transportation?
It's a very complicated and almost intractable problem in the United States, right? Only 1.2% of the landmass of the 35 largest metro US areas are walkable. And that tells you a lot about the way that the built environment, which is very difficult to bring back from this sprawl condition, is organized. Transport is also the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the US. It's 28% of the total. Vehicle use is up 12% since 2019, but it's not hopeless, right? In a city like LA, miles traveled in vehicles has declined, and new public transport projects worth billions of dollars have come online. A lot of light rail, which some people in the US don't like, subways seem to be the gold standard. But as we know from many countries globally, light rail works super well. And cities like LA, which is famously car dependent, being able to make fundamental change is a profound thing. However, a lot of it's really cultural. The bias toward having a car in the US, the stigma against using public transport, that it's for poor people, is really hard to move. And that's where I think social change in legislation, congestion pricing, taxes can all influence it. But changing that culture is hard, but it's not impossible.
You are with The Curator, our weekly highlights show here on Monocle Radio. It is easy to forget, but this election is not only a fight for the presidency. It's also about the shape of the House and the Senate. New York might appear safely Democratic on these fronts, but outside of the city there are some very tight races that could determine who has the majority in Congress, which is just part of the reason Donald Trump held one of his most recent rallies in New York. The reporter Poppy Damon has been to Peekskill in Westchester County, upstate New York, to explore one such race where debate is dominated by Proposition 1, establishing whether rights to abortion should or should not be enshrined in the state constitution. This singular issue has served as a microcosm for the culture war that we've seen dominate the political landscape across the board.
Peekskill, New York. Population 25,000. One issue that dominates.
Proposition 1.
Proposition 1. Prop 1.
Peekskill is a riverside town in the Hudson Valley. It looks beautiful right now, autumnal leaves and surrounded by lakes. We arrive on a rainy day on a train from Manhattan. My editor Charlie and I are not familiar with the area, but luckily we have someone local who has agreed to show us around in his car.
Yes, where are your bikes?
Oh, you didn't tell him it was raining and we thought it was raining.
Fair enough. It might not be the weather for it.
That's John Scott Bennett.
I am a documentary filmmaker working on a docuseries on the Peekskill riots of 1949.
The riot he's referring to was in response to a concert by black singer Paul Robeson, who is well known for his strong pro-trade union stance, civil rights activism, and communist affiliations. John had previously had a film refused to be shown locally, The Tale of a Native American Massacre. The reason given?
It makes America look bad, which is kind of strange for a film about an event that took place 130 years before there was an America.
This idea that Peekskill is a place with a lot of anxiety about its politics started to become something palpable. It ran through every person we spoke to about Proposition 1, and maybe that's because of the swing nature of the politics here.
You'll see, signs all over the place of, Prop 1, yes, no Prop 1, Mondaire Jones, Mike Lawler, and it can go, house to house differences between, these two sides, very different stances, just right next to each other.
Mondaire Jones was the US representative for this district from 2001 to 2023. A Democrat and rising star of the left, he was defeated in 2022. He lost to a Republican, Mike Lawler. But he's back on the ticket to try and win his seat back.
I would say that anybody who wants to vote for Mike Lawler is going to vote no. Anybody who's going to vote for Mondaire Jones is going to vote yes.
We meet Gina Vols-Bonga and Hillary on the street corner outside a library where early voting is in full flow. They were there to remind voters that the amendment to Prop 1 was also on the ballot. Their bright yellow notice board reads, "Don't forget to flip your ballot," all in caps. The big pushback on this proposition, with signs to show it, is the idea that by not only protecting sex-based rights, but gender as well, this will mean trans women will have access to women's sports. But Tina and Hillary think this isn't how the amendment will be interpreted in practice, and this is all really about something else.
Yeah, I think it's fear, and so many lies are perpetrated because of the fear, and they win because people are so afraid.
Tina is clutching at her flyers tightly and calling out to people as they pass. She's hoping her presence will assuage those very fears. But what was very clear is that she's also worried about the Republican candidate Mike Lawler winning again.
What really drives me crazy is that he acts like he's a bridge to Trump. Well, I don't frankly feel like we need a bridge to Trump. And so
we need a bridge away from Trump.
Away from Trump. We need a bridge away. And then we need to figure out how we're going to talk to these people and live next to each other.
Our activity on the high street is getting us noticed by a couple of men outside a barber's shop. One is Latino and a strong Trump supporter.
Come on, bro. I thought you were Donald Trump supporter.
They suggest we go to a business opposite run by a notorious Trump supporter. They promise he's sure is vocal and full of grievance about how hard it is to walk around in a MAGA hat. But he won't go on tape, which is sad given the passion with which he speaks about his views.
Oh my God, it made the best person win.
It's clear there is not a messy middle here. It's two sides talking to themselves. Trump voters feel persecuted, liberals fearful and uncomprehending. Our friends then point us down the road to a local bakery, where there's a 30-year-old tradition of making cookies with candidates' faces printed in icing. Not unusual for a small-town bakery, but this year, things feel different. So I'm in the bakery. I'm looking at the evenly split, I have to say, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris biscuits that are famous in this particular establishment. And I'm just waiting to see if the owner will speak to me about the election. The biscuits depict Trump looking serious in his uniform red tie and Kamala smiling behind a US flag. Both have white frosting around the photographic image. Homestyle Bakery in Peekskill has been making cookies with the faces of political candidates on them for years, since Clinton, 92. Since then, the family-owned bakery, which has been in business for more than 50 years, has made butter cookies hand-cut and printed with the faces of every presidential candidate without incident. This year, however, they received hateful threats.
Some people didn't even want one of the candidates on the pan at all.
Jake, the owner, comes out to speak to me.
Over the years, nobody's ever said anything. This was the first time. I really can't say why they feel the way they do. But we never get involved. We don't take sides. We're just making cookies, trying to make everybody happy.
Do the desserts, do the biscuits, do the cookies predict the results in terms of sales?
I want to say I feel good about what we're selling of the amounts. I said, yeah, I don't want to say that, what it is, but I'm pretty sure.
You can call it.
Yeah.
You won't say.
I won't say.
With an issue as hot as Proposition 1, it seems in Peekskill voters are keeping their cards close to their chest for fear of reprisals for expressing their views, a sign perhaps of the political climate we live in, that even Republican and Democrat biscuits can't share a plate. Luckily for Jake, there is plenty else on the menu.
Apple, cherry, blueberry, peach, strudel.
For Monocle Radio in Peekskill, New York, I'm Poppy Damon. And finally, on this week's Curator, for more on the state of American democracy and elections, not just here but around the world, I spoke with Rachel Dean Wilson, Managing Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., and with Tony Banbury, President and CEO of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. I began by asking Rachel what she's made of the fact that this election has focused so much on the very idea of democracy and the sanctity of elections, more than any other presidential cycle.
So I'm going to take you back to the midterm elections in 2022 when we were looking at candidates and how they were talking about the issue of threats to democracy. And in 2022, this was definitely a campaign issue, but it was an emerging campaign issue. This is an even more entrenched, politicized topic, which is someone who works on democracy in the United States is really not a great trend line here. But it is something that has become more politicized over the last 2 years.
Tony, when you listen to that and you put on your hat, having been around the world looking at lots of different elections over the last year, this is the year of elections globally. What strikes you as different, I guess, about the kind of debates we're having about this in the United States compared to some of the other elections you've been watching?
One of the biggest shifts in international democracy support and electoral support that has taken place just over the past few years is the work of election commissions in countries around the world that used to be so focused on having a proper technical administration of the elections. Now they've had to embrace a new and even higher priority, which is building trust in the integrity of the elections, trust of the electorate, building and sustaining that trust. And we see very often now in countries around the world, and we see it in the U.S., doubts about the integrity of the elections, attacks against those who are administering the elections.
Rachel, I mean, here, absolutely, this issue of trust is the central issue. How do you feel like that has evolved, I guess, from 2020? We were kind of surprised at that point maybe that trust would be an issue. Now it's almost just a given, as you were talking about, that there is this partisanship and for different reasons for either side, as you mentioned, but trust really is key right now.
Absolutely key. And that was so well put, and kind of the impact of when trust gets degraded over time. I would say the way it has evolved in the United States, we were taken off guard in 2020. I think since then, yes, it has become our adversaries at home, our foreign adversaries, and then bad actors at home are more, better able to jump on divisive issues to sow doubt in the process. But what I will also say is different is that we have communities that are not surprised when people are pushing false narratives. So in Erie, Pennsylvania, there was a kind of organizer, if you will, that started raising doubt about voters that were registered and saying that 50 some odd people were registered at this church and no one lived there. And these Benedictine nuns in Erie, Pennsylvania have pushed back so hard on this. And they've been doing interviews with every major news outlet. And it seems like these are small acts, but these are our communities and like real Americans fighting back against bad information. And it is a bright spot in this election cycle.
Tony, I guess to jump off of that point as well, I do wonder if that's something we see around the world. Or is there something different about the U.S. when it comes to the fact that this trust is kind of seeping all the way down? Is that different here than other parts of the world?
The issue of trust and the impact of mis and disinformation is a huge commonality. One way or the other, it's having an enormous impact on electoral processes, campaigning. They're skeptical about whatever they're seeing online. And so when an election is taking place, campaign is taking place in countries around the world, people are maybe not so susceptible to being fooled by misinformation coming out of some campaign, but they are not necessarily willing to believe what should be trusted sources of information, like election administrators or legitimate government offices. And that presents a huge challenge to those responsible for conducting elections when they're trying to convince people that the elections are going to be trustworthy and legitimate and people should turn out as expected. If people don't trust the system, if they don't trust those responsible for the elections, they're going to either not turn out or not accept the results, neither of which are good outcomes for democracy. People around the world are really shaken by what they've seen in the U.S., certainly from 2020 and January 6th. It shocked Americans. It shocked people around the world who had an image of the U.S. not as some perfect democracy. I think these are smart people. They're realistic. So they saw in the U.S. a flawed model, but one that was still to be emulated, respected, looked up to. Now there's much more uncertainty about the durability of the U.S. model, the strength of the U.S. model, whether it's institutions or processes or norms, all of which have come under a little bit of attack and have wobbled a bit. And when there's a wobble in the U.S. democracy, it's a wobble that's felt around the world.
Well, that is all the time we have for this edition of The Curator. The show was produced by Sam Impey and presented by me, Chris Chermak. Join us again next week to hear some of the very best programs here on Monocle Radio. Thanks for listening.